Hello everyone, this is Professor Nassar, and in this lecture we're going to cover the anatomy of peritoneum and mesentery. Before we begin, just a quick review on what peritoneum is, and just to give you some context. Recall from chapter 4 of your textbook, they talk about membranes of the body. After they talk about the 4 basic tissue types, they then talk about membranes of the body, a concept we talked about back in A&P 1, but it's been a little while. Maybe you just need a refresher or haven't thought about this in a while. Just to recall, there are 3 membranes that we talk about in the body in general. The first is called the cutaneous membrane. That's basically your skin. The second is our mucous membranes. These are membranes that line body cavities that open to the outside world. So for example, your gastrointestinal tract is lined by a mucous membrane. Your respiratory tract and your urogenital tracts are also lined by mucous membranes. They consist of epithelial cells that produce mucus and help keep those passageways lubricated. The third of the membranes of the body that I want to talk about, or that they mention in Chapter 4, is the one we're going to be talking about here, and those are serous membranes. And recall, the purpose of serous membranes is that they secrete serous fluid. That's why they're called serous membranes. Serous membranes secrete serous fluid, and what serous fluid does is it acts as a lubricant. It basically prevents organs in your body from sticking to one another. You might think, what's the big deal if one organ sticks to the other? But in fact, because some of your organs are very, very soft and fragile, any sort of stickiness between the two of them could end up tearing part of the organ apart, which of course wouldn't be good for your long-term survival. Recall that serous membranes consist of 2 layers. There is a parietal layer, which is the outer layer, and that lines usually the body wall or body cavity. And then there's the layer that rests directly on the organ itself, and we call that the visceral layer. Again, it looks something like this. So we have 3 organs or 3 organ systems that we're going to talk about. The heart, the lungs, and the abdominal viscera. What we're going to focus on today is number 3. But just to review, the serous membrane, all of these have serous membranes that surround them. The serous membrane that surrounds the heart, you may recall, is called pericardium. The serous membrane that surrounds the lungs is called pleura. The serous membrane that surrounds the abdominal viscera is called peritoneum. We've talked about pericardium and pleura already in this course, and in this week's lab, we're going to be discussing peritoneum. Again, the basic idea behind a serous membrane, if you need just a quick review, is something like this. The concept is the same no matter what the serous membrane is surrounding. So here we have a cartoon heart. Here we have a cartoon lung. Let's just draw the thoracic wall here, your rib cage on the outside. Regardless of what the organ is, the nature of the serous membrane surrounding it work pretty much the same way in the heart and the lungs. So for example, here you have your heart. Let me switch back to and the serous membrane surrounds the heart something like this. I'm exaggerating the nature of the membrane just so you can see it a little bit better. But it's situated something like this, where we have the outer layer is the parietal pericardium. The inner layer is the visceral pericardium, which I'm just going to abbreviate as VP. And then, of course, the space in between here is called the sac or the cavity. In this case, because the serous membrane is pericardium, we call it the pericardial sac or the pericardial cavity. You can use either term. Well, maybe you can't use either term. Maybe your professor wants you to use a particular term, but in any case. In the lungs, it's the same idea. I drew my ribcage a little too close. Sorry about that. The ribcage should really sit on the outside of the parietal layer. So let me redraw the rib cage out here. See, your drawings don't have to be perfect. So again, here is the lung. The outer layer of the serous membrane that surrounds the lung we now know is pleura, and because this is the outer layer, we got to call this the parietal pleura. The parietal pleura then invests itself on the surface of the lung, and again, this layer is called the visceral pleura. And then there is a space inside, in between the parietal pleura and the visceral pleura, and that's called the pleural sac or the pleural cavity. Okay, I know that's a bit small, and it's just to give you a quick review and overview because you've had this information in theory already. If it's new for you or you need a review, hopefully that serves as gives you a little bit of context for what's about to come next. Pretty exciting stuff. Okay, so next we talk about peritoneum, and for this we're going to draw another figure on here. Now again, I would suggest that as you watch this, you pull out a piece of paper and draw along with me. You might think, Professor Nassar, I'm a really crappy artist. My drawing is not going to look anywhere as good as yours. But really, my drawing is not that good. To people who actually can do art, they're going to look at this and think that it was done, by their dog while asleep and maybe drunk and passed out in their backyard or something. But in this case, you just do your best. It's for you, and the idea is you practice and repeat. The idea is not to just do this once, but to do this a couple of times, maybe even like every day if you have the time to do it, just to really help reinforce these concepts in your head. Particularly this concept of peritoneum and mesentery. Not only do these structures tie a lot of things together literally, but they also tie a lot of the concepts that we're going to be talking about with regard to the anatomy of the GI tract. They tie it together sort of figuratively, so, well, whatever the word I'm looking for. It ties a lot of concepts together, and I think hopefully by the end of this, you will see how that works. Okay, so what I'm going to draw here is basically a cross-section of body cavity. So something like this. You want to draw a nice big circle. Okay, that's far from a perfect circle, but it doesn't need to be any better than that. Then down here, this is basically a cross-section of your abdominal cavity. So this is going to be part of your intestine. So we'll put your gut here. This is your abdominal body wall. And just for context, let's put a vertebrae up here. So this is your posterior surface. This is basically your back, and this is anterior. This is your belly. And also, just for context, let's put in an aorta up here. And so the aorta doesn't feel too left out. Why don't we put in some organs? Why don't we put in a kidney here? And another kidney here. Like so. Okay. All right. The gut also has a serous membrane that surrounds it, and that serous membrane again is called peritoneum. And just like with the heart and with the lungs, in fact, let me just keep this out so you have this for context. Just like with the heart and the lungs, there is a parietal peritoneum and a visceral peritoneum, and they look something like this. So the parietal peritoneum, let me put it in color you can see a little more with contrast. Let me put it in green. The parietal peritoneum basically lines the wall of your abdominal cavity. So it would be somewhere out here. Looking something like that. So this would be your parietal peritoneum. The gut itself is surrounded by visceral peritoneum. You remember that the visceral layer of all serous membranes are found on the organ itself. So in this case, the organ is part of the gut. This could be basically part of your small intestine, let's say. And so the visceral layer will be on the gut itself. Something like this. We're going to draw a circle, but we're not going to complete the circle at the top. We're going to leave it a little bit open. So this is the visceral peritoneum. Okay, so the parietal peritoneum comes around sort of on the underside or the anterior surface of the kidneys. And this is where things get a little funny or diverge a little bit from our usual model of how parietal and visceral layers work. If you notice in the heart and the lung model here, the parietal pericardium sort of has just a short distance before it turns into the visceral pericardium, and same with the parietal and visceral pleura of the lungs. That transition point where it inflects goes from the parietal to the visceral layer, here and here, is a rather short distance. Not so much in your abdominal cavity for some of your abdominal organs. Your gut is way down here, and the parietal peritoneum is way up here. And so as a result, there is basically the serous membrane has to sort of dangle a little bit down like so. And there's basically a connector of serous membrane that connects the parietal layer with the visceral layer. And that connector is called mesentery. So for the purpose of this course, at this level of the game, mesentery basically serves two functions. It connects the parietal peritoneum with the visceral peritoneum, and it also has a second purpose. Remember that aorta we drew up there? This gut needs a blood supply. It needs an arterial supply. It needs a venous blood supply. It also needs lymphatic vessels to go to and from it. And it also needs a nerve supply. How do all of those structures get to the gut when all of those structures tend to be sort of gathered up in this part of the body? Well, there is an opening here between these two sides of the mesentery. And so the aorta will send a branch of itself down to the gut in between those two regions of mesentery. And so mesentery also serves a purpose as a passageway for arteries, veins, lymphatics, and nerves to and from the organ in question, in this case, your gut. What's in this space here? Recall that just like how we had a pericardial cavity in the heart and a pleural cavity in the lung, what would you call this space? That's right. You would call this the peritoneal cavity. What's in the peritoneal cavity? Absolutely nothing. It is empty, except for a few milliliters of serous fluid. And again, that serous fluid acts as a lubricant to prevent organs from sticking to one another. It keeps your gut from sticking to your body wall, and it keeps your gut from sticking to other parts of your gut. There are two other terms that come up when we talk about this sort of arrangement of the mesentery and all these other organs in terms of how they're situated. And the two terms are this. The gut, in this case, this portion of the gut, not your entire gastrointestinal tract from your mouth down to your anus, but at least this portion of your gut, which represents, let's say, part of your small intestine, is considered intraperitoneal, meaning that intra means within, and peritoneal refers to the peritoneum. It lies sort of within the peritoneum. It's completely invested by this visceral and parietal peritoneum, and it's connected to one another by this mesentery. If you notice above the gut, we drew those kidneys. I bet you thought I was just drawing those kidneys just to have fun drawing a kidney. But in fact, no, this was a bit of cartooning foreshadowing, or maybe anatomical foreshadowing. The kidneys, if you notice, they sort of sit behind the peritoneum. They are posterior to it. Only one side of them is really lined by peritoneum. The other side, not so much. So there's a term to describe this situation as well, and it's called retroperitoneal. Retro means behind. And so this is an organ that sits behind the peritoneum. These two terms are important to know, but don't feel too badly if you forget them, as you probably will forget a lot of A&P over the upcoming weeks, even though you try so hard to learn it. I have even had former medical students who have come back to me when they were in their fellowship, and they came to me and asked, not students, but okay, one student who came to me while he was in his fellowship in radiology and said, Professor Nassar, can you remind me again, what does retroperitoneal mean? So these are terms that you're learning as an undergraduate, but you will encounter them again. We teach them again at sort of the postgraduate medical level. And even after that, some of these terms don't always stick with people at that level of the game. So we throw a lot of terms at you. Don't feel too badly if you can't remember them for sort of the rest of your life. The idea is with repeat exposure, you get better and better at becoming more comfortable and familiar with them. So patience, practice, repeat. Okay, that is part one. The next part is sort of ties this together, and what I want to do is sort of show you this from a side view. But I don't want to show it to you in a human. I want you to sort of think back to the days when you were a fish. And the reason I want to draw a fish instead of a person for the time being is to show you essentially how this system was essentially set up, or how it looks sort of in a more basic form in a typical vertebrate. So what I'm going to do here is just draw a little cartoon fish, like a little goldfish or something like that. It doesn't have to be a perfect looking fish. Okay, something like that. That is a pretty ugly fish, but it gets the point across. This is going to be the mouth. And over here will be the anus. And what we're going to do is we're going to draw the gut, a big tube that basically stretches from the mouth to the anus. So here is its mouth. Here is its sort of esophagus. We'll draw a little bit of a stomach. And if you notice, I'm going to draw the stomach a little peculiarly. Maybe this is more anatomical foreshadowing. And then we'll draw the rest of the intestinal tract, something like that. Okay. Recall that in the human stomach, which I just happen to have one handy right here. How about I orient it properly as well? Now, in human, the stomach is sort of situated this way. If you were looking at somebody face forward, the esophagus is here, the small intestine is here. In this fish, this stomach is sort of oriented this way, where this is the greater curvature. And here is the greater curvature. This is the lesser curvature. And here is the lesser curvature. This is initially how your stomach is positioned, sort of in a quadrupedal vertebrate. or in a, maybe even if you don't have legs, in a sort of a more primitive vertebrate. But of course, in you and me, during development, the stomach sort of twists and turns and gets moved around and ends up in sort of this position. But in any case, to sort of replicate what it would look like here, let's just draw in to remind ourselves that there is a greater curvature here in the stomach. How about we write that this is the stomach too? And that this is the lesser curvature here, so I'm writing, I know it's small, I'm writing GC here and LC there. Okay, here is the exciting part. Do you remember what attaches to the greater curvature of the stomach? Now, if you haven't watched my video that I've also posted up here on the gross anatomy of the stomach, you may want to just do that real quick and then come back to this. And look at me, I'm holding the stomach wrong again. Do you remember what attaches to the greater curvature of the stomach? What is this membrane again called? That's right, it's called the greater omentum. Do you remember where it attaches? Like this side of it attaches to the stomach, but do you remember where the other side attaches? It attaches to what's considered your dorsal body wall, basically the inside of your back. So let's draw that on here. So here is the greater curvature of your stomach, and coming off of here is going to be a... What is this, actually? Well, we'll tell you in a second. I don't want to ruin the surprise. So this is the greater omentum. This is a tissue that comes off the stomach, and it's going to be attaching somewhere up here to the dorsal body wall, basically the back side of the fish. Now, you may recall that since this is the intestine, or the gut, that the gut basically has a sheet of mesentery that connects the visceral peritoneum that would be surrounding all of this to the parietal peritoneum that would be surrounding the body wall of the fish. So let's draw in that mesentery. The mesentery would basically go from about where the anus is up this way as well. And so this would be mesentery. And suddenly I hope you see that there's a connection. See how we call this mesentery and we call this greater omentum? What is the greater omentum? I know it's one of the big mysteries of some anatomical people's lives. What is the greater omentum? The greater omentum is really just a named mesentery. How about that? Do you remember that the stomach also has a lesser curvature? Do you recall what attaches to the lesser curvature of the stomach? Of course, now you all remember it's called the lesser omentum. Do you remember where the lesser omentum goes? Recall the greater omentum is really a sheet of tissue that continues along the surface of the stomach and then continues along this side as the lesser omentum. Where does the lesser omentum go? What does it attach to? That's right. It surrounds the liver, it attaches to the liver, and then actually it keeps going to the ventral body wall. So let's draw that in. So here we would draw lesser omentum going downward like so. And in this sheet of tissue, we need to draw the liver. Because the liver gets wrapped up in all of this too. Now, you may notice that the greater omentum is part of this mesentery, and this mesentery suspends the gut from above dorsally. So sometimes this is also known as the dorsal mesentery, even though we don't really refer to it as dorsal, and we just tend to simply call it mesentery. The reason why is because if you notice, the greater omentum is really part of this dorsal mesentery. It's all sort of one continuous sheet. Is there a ventral mesentery? This is the surprise, and where some anatomy students who have been sort of really trying to understand this suddenly gasp and a light bulb goes off in their head, because when they look back at this figure, they realize that while there's a mesentery suspending the gut from above, there is no mesentery suspending the gut from below. The exception comes in the stomach. The stomach has a ventral mesentery. We call it the lesser omentum. Just like the greater omentum is basically a named part of the dorsal mesentery, the lesser omentum is a named part of the ventral mesentery. But Professor Nassar, there is no ventral mesentery that suspends the gut. What happened to it? Well, there used to be a ventral mesentery that suspends the gut, and I think, if I recall right, and I'm sorry if I'm offending some ichthyologists, I think in fish it is still there. But what happens, and unfortunately we don't have an ichthyologist in the house, I think that's a Far Side cartoon, so I can't really confirm right now, but maybe someone can tell me later. So what happens to the ventral mesentery? The ventral mesentery in us, it disappears. It regresses. I.e., it disappears. Almost. What happens to it? In you and me, the ventral mesentery forms the falciform ligament of the liver. The adult remnant of the ventral mesentery in humans is the falciform ligament of the liver, i.e., whoa! Well, now I can really build up the suspense. I bumped the camera. I.e., how's that for a grandiose finish for my act? I.e., this structure right here. Again, if we were looking at the liver from a superior view or an anterior view, we have a right lobe, a left lobe, and this structure, which is the falciform ligament of the liver. This is the remnant of the ventral mesentery that we were seeing back here in this fish. Okay, before my whole setup just gets destroyed any further, I think I should stop there. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. I'm not going to stop here. I'm going to actually keep going just a little more, see how much further I can get away with this. Let me just try and fix this setup a little bit. Because I want to show you one more thing. I want to show you a model. Let me zoom out. So this is a model of your abdominal viscera. In this case, again, this is superior, inferior. This is the left side. This is the right side. Here is your pancreas. The stomach would normally be sitting somewhere up a little above this, and also sitting in this region here. This is all part of your small intestine. This is all part of your large intestine. We'll go over the parts of this in a different video. What I want to focus on here is this structure here. This is your greater omentum. This is the part of your dorsal mesentery. It sits over your abdominal viscera, and it's a very, very thin membrane. It's so thin that you could literally, if this were a real anatomical feature, you could lift it up, sort of like how you could, I can lift up this sort of sheet of paper. In fact, let me just get a sheet of paper. If this sheet of paper were the greater omentum, I could actually lift it up like so and see the organs that were sitting underneath. Now in this case, only half of your abdominal viscera is covered by mesentery. Or sorry, only half of the abdominal viscera is covered by your greater omentum. The model is arranged as such so that they have cut half of the greater omentum off so that you're seeing the left half, but the right half is the greater omentum has been removed so you can see what's underneath it. But here it is, and you have to imagine that it's basically attaching to the dorsal body wall, coming up this way, and then attaching to the greater curvature of the stomach. The stomach would be sitting or situated on this, something like this. This is how we tie this all together. So here is the greater curvature of the stomach. Here is the greater omentum attaching to that greater curvature of the stomach, like so. On the back side is where we see mesentery. This is, again, the sheet of serous membrane that connects the parietal peritoneum that surround organs like your colon and your duodenum. And this connects the visceral layers that are on here with the parietal layer that would be surrounding your body wall. So the mesentery that we see here in this figure is the same structure that we see here. Notice all these blood vessels that are traveling through it, just like we have the blood vessel traveling through the aorta here. You can see all the blood vessels that are traveling through this mesentery here. So all of this light gray structure is mesentery. In this case, because the mesentery is attaching to the colon, the name of this is called mesocolon. The part of the mesentery that attaches to the duodenum, you could call mesoduodenum. So when we talk about mesentery attaching to a structure, we usually use the prefix meso. Mesentery doesn't just attach to your gut, as we will see in later labs. Mesentery also surrounds other organs in your abdominal cavity, like the ovaries and the uterus and part of the oviduct and so on. Okay, I think that's enough about talking about fish and other structures. I hope you found that enjoyable and got something out of that. My apologies for the snafu in the camera setup, but hopefully it gets the point across. All right, good luck everybody, and hopefully this ties some concepts together for you. We'll see you soon.